Hey everybody, this video is called Take Heed Solomon, and today we're continuing our study here through the book of 1 Kings chapter 9, and we're going to be looking at God's warning to Solomon right before Solomon becomes a hot mess. So we're going to be in chapter 9 today, and I promise this video will not be as long as the one from last night. But 1 Kings chapter 9 verse 1 through 6 starting out says, "And it came to pass, when Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house and all of Solomon's desires which he wanted to do, that the Lord appeared to Solomon the second time, as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. And the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your supplication that you have made before me. I have consecrated this house which you have built to put my name there forever. And in my eyes, in my heart, will there be perpetually. Now, if you walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and in uprightness, to do according to all that I have commanded you, and if you keep my statutes and my judgments, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying, you shall not fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. But if you or your sons at all turn from following me, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes, which I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and this house which I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight. Israel will be a proverb and a byword among all peoples." So if you want further reading on the text here, check out 2 Chronicles chapter 7 verse 11 through 22. But the Lord's response comes here approximately 12 years after Solomon's prayer and supplication that we looked at last night. And we looked at verses 22 through 53 is where we left off with Solomon's prayer there. And the Lord, he made the temple holy by being present in the cloud, as seen back in chapter 8, verse 10 in the last chapter. And as proof of the temple's consecration, the Lord told Solomon that he had to put his name there. And God wasn't saying that he would dwell in the building forever, since in less than 400 years it would be destroyed by the Babylonians. Verse 3, many people will look at verse 3 here, and the Lord said to him, I will have heard your prayer and your supplication that you have made before me. I have consecrated this house which you have built to put my name there forever, and my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. So verse 3, it's often looked at for those who are premillennialists. They hold on to that the millennial reign of Christ, 1,000 years literally, is still to take place. And that is one of the verses that they hold to in their stances. And they see it as God is saying here that Jerusalem and the Temple Mount are to be his earthly throne for as long as the earth remains. And eyes and heart are symbolic for the Lord's constant attention and his deep affection for Israel. And by implication, God promised them an access to his presence and answers for their prayers. And the Lord reiterated to Solomon the importance of obedience, as stated many times in the Mosaic statutes, in order to experience the blessings of the Davidic covenant. And if Israel was to abandon the Lord to worship other gods, God would expel Israel from the land and destroy the temple, as we see in the very verse 7. And if Solomon walked before God in obedience and faithfulness, he could expect blessing on his reign and the reign of his descendants, and the dynasty of David would endure forever. And interesting to note, God did not demand perfect obedience from Solomon, as we know that David did not walk perfectly before the Lord. And right before 2 Samuel we see that that David was not perfect in his walk with God. And God told Solomon to walk before him as David walked. And that's why I argue that God was not calling Solomon for perfect, like no issues at all. He wasn't calling for perfect obedience. He was calling for obedience in heart. In verse 7 through 9, it says, "Then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and this house which I have consecrated for my name, I will cast out of my sight. Israel will be a proverb and byword among all peoples. And as for this house, which is exalted, everyone who passes by it will be astonished and will hiss and say, why has the Lord done this thus to this land and to our house? Then they will answer, because they have forsook the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and have embraced other gods and worshipped them and served them before the Lord has brought all this calamity on them." And so God blessed the temple, and God filled the temple with his presence, but he would cast it out of his sight if Israel forsook him. And under the old covenant, God promised to use Israel to exalt himself among the nations one way or another. And the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile from the land were predicted by Moses back in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 24 through 28. And the devastation of the temple in 586 BC graphically demonstrated the Lord's anger against Israel's sin, particularly the sin of idolatry. And in verse 7 of the Living Bible translation, it uses vivid wording that Israel will become a joke to the nations and an example of proverb of sudden disaster. In verse 10 through 14, it says, "Now it happened at the end of the 20 years, when Solomon had built the two houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house. Hiram, the king of Tyre, had supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress and gold as much as he desired. That King Solomon then gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. Then Hiram went from Tyre to see the cities which Solomon had given him, but they did not please him. So he said, what kind of cities are these which you have given me, my brother? And he called them the land of Kabul, as they are to this day. Then Hiram sent the king 120 talents of gold." So verse 10 through 14, you can see here through verse 28 later in 2 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 1 through 18. In the completion of the building of the temple in Solomon's palace, it took 20 years combined. And Solomon sold these 20 cities in Galilee to Hiram in exchange for the gold. And the 20 cities were given to Hiram. It likely laid along the border between Tyre and Israel, just out the territory of Asher. And later, you see Hiram gave these towns back to Solomon. In verse 15 through 24 says, "And this is the reason for the labor force which King Solomon raised to build the house of the Lord, his own house, the Millo, the wall of Jerusalem, Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and taken Gezer and burned it with fire, had killed the Canaanites who dwelt in the city, and had given it a dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife. And Solomon built Gezer, Lower Beth Horon, Baalath, and Tadmor in the wilderness, in the land of Judah. All the storage cities that Solomon had, cities for his chariots and cities for his cavalry, and whatever Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem and Lebanon, and in all the land of his dominion. And all the people who were left of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, who were not of the children of Israel, that is, their descendant, who were left in the land after them, whom the children of Israel had not been able to destroy completely, from these Solomon raised forced labor, as it is to this day. But of the children of Israel, Solomon made no forced laborers, because they were men of war, and his servants, his officers, his captains, commanders of his chariots and his cavalry. Others were chiefs of the officials who were over Solomon's work, 550 who ruled over the people who did the work. But Pharaoh's daughter came up from the city of David to her house, which Solomon had built for her. Then he built the Millo. Now 3 times a year Solomon offered burnt offerings and peace offerings on the altar which he had built for the Lord, and he burnt incense with them on the altar that was before the Lord. So he finished the temple. And so verse 15 through 24, the Millo was a landfill in the depression between the city of David and the temple and palace complex to the north. And Hazor was 10 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, and it protected Israel's northeastern entrance from Syria to Mesopotamia. And Megiddo guarded a crucial pass in the Carmel Mountains, which linked to the valley of Jezreel and the international coastal highway to Egypt. And Gezer was 20 miles west of Jerusalem. And Gezer lay in the coastal plain at the intersection of the coastal highway and the main road to Jerusalem. And Lower Beth Horon was approximately 12 miles northwest of Jerusalem along a road connecting Gibeon to the western lowlands and providing a western approach to Jerusalem. And Tadmar was probably the same as Tamar, 16 miles southwest of the Dead Sea on the southeastern boundary of the land. And another Tadmar existed 150 miles northeast of Damascus, which is likely the reference that's found later in 2 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 4. So you're welcome. You get a free geography lesson in today's video. But stored cities, the primary purpose of them was to store food, as seen later on in 2 Chronicles 17, verse 12, and 2 Chronicles 32, verse 28. And you see that Solomon built military outposts for his chariots and his horses. And to defend his kingdom, these garrisons were probably located along the key roads throughout the nations. And the cities listed between verses 15 through 19 met this requirement. And in verses 20 through 23, it's also discussed in 2 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 7 through 10. And only resident aliens permanently became part of this force, since the law did not allow the Israelites to make fellow Israelite slaves against their own will. And we see the passages on their slave, what the laws were for having slaves back in Exodus chapter 21, verse 2 through 11, and Leviticus chapter 25, verse 44 through 46, and Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 12 through 18. And additionally, verse 22, it adds that he didn't move someone from an established post, even for a specific project. But verse 25 through 28, to wrap up the chapter text here, says, Now 3 times a year Solomon offered burnt offerings and peace offerings on the altar which he had built for the Lord, and he burned incense with them on the altar that was before the Lord. So he finished the temple. King Solomon also built a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Elath, on the shore of the Red Sea, in the land of Edom. Then Hiram sent his servants with the fleet seamen who knew the sea to work with the servants of Solomon. And they went to Ophir and acquired 420 talents of gold from there and brought it to King Solomon. So to wrap up the last few verses here, once the temple had been built, Solomon's practice of sacrificing to God at the various high places came to an end. And he kept Israel's three great annual feasts, the unleavened bread, Pentecost, and the tabernacles at the temple in Jerusalem. And Ezion Geber was Solomon's port located in the modern Gulf of Aqaba. And the location of Ophir is unknown. And it has been suggested that it was located on the southwestern Arabian Peninsula. In the next chapter, in verses 11 and 12, it suggests that it was possibly close to or a part of the kingdom of Sheba. And 420 talents was approximately 16 tons of gold. In 2 Chronicles 8:18, it gives account for 450 talents of gold. But some suggest that Ophir was located on the eastern coast of Africa. And so to wrap up, we're going to do a quick wrap up here. So we're going to be done before 20 minutes, most likely. But today we looked at God appearing to Solomon, and God confirms his answer to Solomon's prayer. And I want to look at Revelation chapter 21. Verse 1 and 2. It says, "Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no more sea. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband." And one thing I wanted to make note thereof is even during the new heaven and the new earth, the eternal state, there will always be the heavenly Jerusalem where God will eternally dwell. And we saw God's warning to Solomon, and we looked at the ways and the means of Solomon's great building of the projects that he did. We saw the lumber and gold that he got from King Hiram of Tyre, and we looked at the slave labor from remnant Canaanite peoples. And we looked at the financing from naval expeditions that brought back the gold. So that's going to wrap up today. I know typically it's 10 minutes or less on Saturdays, but we're continuing through 1 Kings today, and we'll see you next week as we're going to get to be introduced to the Queen of Sheba's visit. So I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. God bless. We'll see you this upcoming week.